My name is Andy Nathan. I'm in the political science department at Columbia University. And this is part of an annual event that honors Tim Gillette, who was a very beloved student and colleague of Jerry Cohen. He studied with Jerry at Harvard Law School and worked with Jerry and was an extremely promising China scholar and specialist in Chinese law who had many, many friends in China and Taiwan and in the United States and elsewhere, and was just a beloved person who tragically passed away at the young age of 39. And so the NYU Institute has annually held a conference in his honor. And I think all of us are very pleased to be here to honor him. This is a panel on a subject that Tim would have cared a great deal about, although the landscape has changed a lot since he was active. And that has to do with ethical dilemmas of the China scholar. Ethical dilemmas are not a new thing in the study of China or in any kind of international study. There's the broad dilemma between telling the truth while understanding the other side. And in the case of China, which is a government that, I won't say the Chinese people or the country, but the PRC government certainly cares a tremendous amount about what is said about it internationally and has always wanted to influence that. One might think about, for example, Edgar Snow's book, Red Star Over China, his interview with Mao, and his, you could say, I don't know if he experienced it as an ethical dilemma, but the trade-off that he made between telling Mao's story as Mao wanted it to be told versus telling it critically. It seems to me that ethical dilemmas are always trade-offs between two good things. And he made that choice. More recently, one might think about, for example, Roxanne Whitkey's book called Comrade Jiang Qing. Roxanne was vouchsafed some long interviews with Jiang Qing and came back to the United States to write her story. And the Chinese government immediately started putting various kinds of positive and negative pressure on her to not write that book. But she went ahead and wrote the story, and it was Jiang Qing's story as Jiang Qing wanted it to be written. One may think about the first wave of journalists who went to China after US-China normalization and started to do a lot of interviews and published books. And in doing so, got some of their informants into trouble, and those informants got arrested. So do you take the story and tell it, or do you try to protect the informant? There has been the dilemma of seeking the release of Chinese political prisoners like Wei Jingsheng, for example, and in exchange for their being exiled. One of our panelists, Teng Biao, is an example of that kind of situation. We're delighted to have him here, but we sort of did the work of the Chinese regime in affording asylum to a lot of people who were no longer able to go back to China. But things are different now because the Chinese government has a lot more clout, more ways to punish people, more ways to incentivize people than in the past. And so the ethical problems of being a China scholar are sharper and more constant than ever before. So our panelists are going to discuss this, and I will save time by introducing them only briefly in the order in which they're going to speak. We think that each panelist would speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will have a little dialogue. I'm going to ask Jerry Cohen to come in and bless us and to say some things. He always has something original and thought-provoking to say at that point, and then we'll go to audience Q&A, which I think the audience should put your questions in the chat. I believe that's our game plan. And I'll try to field them, or maybe Alexis Sanborn will assist me in doing that if possible. So let me briefly introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak. The first is Rory Truax. I guess your name is next to your little box, and maybe you want to raise your hand and wave to people. That's Rory, who is an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. And I'm not going to go through anybody's whole bio, but I want to say about Rory that he's been a leader in the process of thinking through some of these issues, particularly with respect to how we teach the subject. So I admire his leadership in thinking about not only being a very good social scientist, but thinking about the ethical issues. Then we're going to hear from Teng Biao, who was a leading human rights lawyer and law professor in China, who co-founded the Open Constitution Initiative of Xu Zhiyong, for example, and the China Against the Death Penalty Initiative, and was one of the leaders in signing the Charter 08, and did many, many things that got him into bad trouble in China. And so he is now in the United States, and he's the Grove Human Rights Scholar at Hunter College of the City University of New York. Then we're going to hear from Eva Peels, who's a professor of law at King's College London, and just the most thoughtful and productive scholar of human rights, the rights defenders movement in China and human rights issues in China, and a very deep thinker about legal and ethical issues and the interaction between law and ethics, and had been associated with other universities as well. And finally, my colleague Ben Liebman, who's at the Columbia Law School. He's the Leaf Professor of Law. He's the director of the Hongyan Chang Center for Chinese Legal Studies. And I just discovered as well that you're the director of the Parker School of Foreign and Comparative Law. So he's a busy guy, and he's got a very active research agenda as well. So we have a great panel. And I guess I'll ask Rory then to start out, and then we'll hear from the others.
All right. Well, thank you, Andy, for that introduction. And it's a real honor to be on this panel with this group of people who I deeply admire. So I would start just by also saying that everything I say today, I hate to have to make a disclaimer, but everything I say represents my personal views, doesn't represent the views of my university. Sometimes that is conflated in these sorts of talks. So today I want to talk about teaching China, and which has always been a little bit fraught. But I would say that the last year, with the move to online teaching and some of the security developments coming out of China, has been particularly problematic. And I've been working with a group of other scholars, Dmitry Georgiev at Syracuse, Xiaobo Liu at UT Austin, Carrie Radigan at Amherst, and Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School, to try to think through some of the key ethical questions and how we might manage them as a scholarly community. I wanted to start, Catherine asked us to think about kind of an ethical dilemma that we could pose to the group to give a sense of the stakes. And I think the simplest one for us is, so imagine you're teaching a course on Chinese politics. That course covers sensitive material, including things like what's going on in Xinjiang or the Tiananmen Square massacre and so forth. Because of remote learning and COVID, you have students who are taking your course all over the world, which means you are being asked to record your course. You have students who are Chinese citizens who would like to take your course, and some of them are residing in mainland China and would like to take your course. The material that you're teaching is formally banned in China or would be inaccessible in China. And without the use of a VPN, your university VPN is at best unreliable. So this is the sort of situation, this is just one of many that are currently facing the China teaching community. And the reason why I say this last year and a half has been sort of a perfect storm for China teaching has been these three trends. The first is the move to online teaching and all that that entails. We're all now very accustomed to speaking on camera, but it isn't a small shift that every single conversation we have is now being recorded or could be recorded. We have no way of knowing if someone is watching or if someone is recording what we're saying. There was always a degree of concern about this. So if you were teaching live in a big lecture hall, there's always a concern that someone could come in and surreptitiously record what you're doing. But to be on camera all the time is a new thing. And it's no small thing that the entire China studies community is now being recorded all the time, speaking about the Chinese government. The second feature of this, which I've already touched on, is the fact that remote learning means that some of our students are residing in the PRC as they take our courses. This is more problematic for courses that actually are about China. I'm less worried about the student taking chemistry. I'm more worried about the student taking ethnic politics in China while being a Chinese citizen in China. And then the third element of this, which I will leave to the lawyers on the panel, but as many of you are probably aware, there's the new national security law passed this summer, which is vague in its language and contains provisions, namely Article 38, which imply extraterritoriality and could potentially be used to criminalize speech outside of China. To date, it does not appear that that piece of law is being used to target foreign scholars and activities in the classroom, but this goes back to Perry Link's idea of the anaconda and the chandelier. There's always this looming threat that this type of legal mechanism could be used. So the question is, given all of these trends, what do we do? Should this change how we teach China? How do we manage some of these problems? And again, I was able to work with a large number of scholars in trying to come up with some basic principles. There's no easy answer, and there's no one right answer. And I think every professor and scholar needs to come up with a set of actions that they feel comfortable with. But the overarching takeaway from working with that group this summer was, I think as a community, we need to pay more attention to security risks than we used to. But we also, I think, need to abide by a general commitment not to change our content. And by that, I mean, people often use the word self-censor, which I think Ben and others have said is sort of a problematic word because it implies, some sense it's like a victim blaming type word. But I would say that the way we think about it is we shouldn't be changing the content of our courses. So if we all of a sudden, because of being afraid, stop teaching about Tiananmen or the Great Leap Forward or Xinjiang in Western classrooms, and we're presenting a sanitized version of Chinese history and the Chinese political system, that's deeply, deeply problematic. So we need to manage the risks, but also have the courage to continue to teach China the way it should be taught. And so in terms of how to manage risks, the principles that I've seen implemented that I think make sense, the first are informed choice, namely treating students as adults, which they are, and providing them information about the risks posed by online education and the study of China. And part of that providing information is also being clear about what we don't know. We don't really know how the national security law is going to be implemented. We have no indication to believe that it's going to be used to target undergraduates or anything like that. But we need to be clear about what we know and what we don't know and where the risks are. And I think we would probably all agree that there is a hierarchy of risks. And in particular, it's Chinese citizens, Chinese nationals who are at greatest risk, and especially those who are residing in China. The second principle, I think, is that we need to just be protecting students as much as we can and coming up with creative solutions to do so. I've implemented blind grading for the first time, which is actually a best practice. This was sensationalized in some media coverage that said that basically the headline was Princeton professor using code names because of fear of Chinese government. We're not using code names, we're just having students not put their names on papers, which is actually a best practice because it prevents racism and sexism and other implicit biases from entering into the grading process. But it also does give students a little bit of a degree of protection when they're writing an essay. They don't formally put their name on it, they're turning it in through a secure platform. I've also been an advocate of discouraging students from the PRC from taking my course this spring. And that might be a little more controversial. I have not banned anybody from taking it, but I've discouraged them and tried to work with students to come up with an alternative plan, which might include an independent study, or it might include taking the course next year when they're able to get back to campus. So working with students, not depriving people of educational opportunities, but also trying to mitigate some risks. I would say that a particularly vulnerable population is our teaching assistants, what we would call our preceptors, which are graduate students, because there is a power dynamic between faculty and graduate students. Many of our graduate students, my graduate students, are Chinese. And so trying to be open and honest with them about what they're comfortable with and coming up with solutions to allow them to be effective and safe in the classroom. So for example, not requiring them to ever be on camera, not requiring them to lecture, not requiring them to potentially even teach certain subjects if they're uncomfortable about it. So trying to protect people. The third principle, which I have mentioned already, is this idea of no self-censorship, a commitment to teach China the way we have before. I should say that that's easy for me to say, in the sense that I'm a Western scholar. I have no family in China. And if I can't go to China out of my own concerns, there's less of an impact on me. So I should say it's easy for us to say don't self-censor or don't stand up for what's right. But many of my colleagues are Chinese citizens, and they're being forced by their universities to speak on camera about the Chinese government, and that is no small thing. So I think we also need to always remember that. And then the final thing I would say is there's a counter risk here, which is that we create an environment of fear. And it's important to be upfront about the risks, but we also don't want to create an environment where students are unwilling to take our courses, or other faculty members who aren't China experts are unwilling to say the word China in their course because they're nervous, or people are sitting in a seminar and unwilling to speak because they're scared. So I think there's a real balance here about being upfront about the problems, but also not being so over concerned about them that we end up creating this other problem. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you again for this invitation, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. That's great. Let's go to Teng Biao then. Oh,
Thank
Catherine,
you.
does Catherine want to say anything? I see she's available, or shall we just proceed? Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for stepping in beautifully. And you said everything that I was hoping to say at the outset, and much better. So there's no need for me to interrupt the flow of what I can see is already a very successful program. So thank you all.
I think I might have given the wrong instructions for Q&A. So do you want to give the correct instructions?
Yeah, so we're going to be using the Q&A panel rather than the chat panel. So anyone who has questions at any point in the program, please start putting them there. Just write them there. Try to make them short if you can, because it's hard to read a long question in a narrow panel. It's hard for us to digest it and understand it. But when we get to the Q&A portion, I'll be selecting from there. So come along starting now.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, Teng Biao, it's your turn.
Okay, there are several aspects of the ethical dilemma of the China scholars. I'm gonna talk a little bit about self-censorship from my experience as a human rights lawyer and scholar in China, and also my experience of teaching human rights and law in the United States. When I taught at a university in Beijing, I didn't censor myself very much. I was one of the very few Chinese scholars in China who dared to discuss the extreme sensitive issues like Tiananmen massacre, Falun Gong, religious persecutions, Tibet and the Uyghurs, etc. And I guess in China, no more than 20 scholars could touch these topics. That's totally understandable. Scholars like me are easily banned from teaching or even fired by the college. I wrote a lot of articles critical of the Chinese Communist Party and the political system. I actively participate in human rights movement and the dissident activities. Because of this, I never got the promotion, and I was banned from teaching a few times and eventually fired, and my passport was confiscated, and I was even kidnapped and detained and tortured by Chinese secret police. But there are lesser sensitive topics like the death penalty, forced eviction, torture, one-child policy, black Jews, corruption, etc. Normally, it's okay to talk about these things in the classroom in China. But in practice, still not many teachers are willing to discuss these issues. If they have to, they will be very careful not to distance themselves too much from the official narrative, official theories. The Chinese government has many forbidden zones, the 学术禁区, so anyone will be punished if they publicly express different opinions from the official ideology. But the border of forbidden zones is not clear and not fixed. Some forbidden topics are explicit, many are not. And the list of the sensitive issues is always expounding and changing. The government's red line keeps constantly changing and relatively vague in order to maximize its intimidation. In an authoritarian or totalitarian system like China, totally avoiding self-censorship is not possible. So scholars have to calculate how far to go, how explicit to be, and with whom to ally, and so on. So if anyone calculates incorrectly, he or she can be lose a job or being imprisoned or even worse. But most censorship doesn't directly involve these things. If it involves the fear of these happenings. So Rory mentioned Perelink's famous metaphor, an anaconda in the chandelier. So the sense of the anaconda crouching overhead means the big brother is watching you. And then everyone will automatically make a big or small adjustment, and eventually you'll get used to the fear and accept it as a part of the normal landscape. In some contexts, self-censorship is totally acceptable, understandable, or even necessary. When a research or a speech may put a third person, is for example, the Chinese partners, co-authors, the interviewees, the students, in great danger, then self-censorship would be necessary, and that's totally not in conflict with any moral principles. And in other contexts, self-censorship is unnecessary. That would be controversial. The scholars exaggerated the potential consequences too much. They may give up any critical opinions on the issues that are not very sensitive. And they thought our article may cost their job, but it turned out nothing happened. A few years ago, ABA, American Bar Association, invited me to write a book, but after I signed the agreement, they rescinded the proposal, and they said to publish my book will endanger their programs in China. So what frequently happens is that scholars over-imagine the terrible consequences to justify their self-censorship. The consequence may be disapproval of your font application, or there isn't any terrible, any trouble about that. But people imagine a lawsuit, a kidnap, or imprisonment. So, so many scholars have too easily given up their research, or cancel a talk, or twisted their wordings. The Chinese government uses visa denial as an effective tool to manipulate and suppress international academics. This is one of the main reasons of rampant self-censorship among Chinese scholars. and our moderator, Professor Andy Nathan, and like Perry Link and many others. A few years ago, the 14 authors of a book, China's Muslim Borderland, were all banned from entering China. So this kind of suffering of visa denial is often higher than it seems to be. A long time training and language study and building connections and network in China, the necessity of field work like that. So it suffered a lot, and it really works for the Chinese government. And sometimes self-censorship is not to avoid punishment, but to gain benefit or keep privilege. When I was a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, and I planned a talk. So the two speakers are me and Chen Guangcheng. And then the university canceled our talk. We have scheduled a date, but then it was canceled. The reason was the Harvard president was in Beijing meeting Xi Jinping. So this kind of self-censorship is cannot be justifiable. So exaggerated fear and the willingness to gain benefit from autocratic regime lead to intellectual dishonesty and moral cowardice. That harms the reputation of a scholar or institution. In some cases, it harms professors' academic freedom, independent thinking, and moral integrity. And some universities, think tanks accepted a huge amount of money from Chinese authorities or the business or institutions that are closely connected to the Chinese government. So normally it's not possible their recruitment choices of research narratives and viewpoints are not influenced by the donors, because that's the CCP's purpose of spending money. And the last point, maybe the Chinese government has increased their harassment and attacks against the international scholars. There are many examples, like Professor Anne Brady in New Zealand. Her home and office were broken into, and her car tires were sabotaged. And recently, some firms and individuals in Xinjiang filed a lawsuit against Andrian Jens, the famous scholar on Xinjiang, the Uyghur genocide. And early this week, Chinese government sanctioned 10 EU individuals, including 2 scholars. So they were banned from, and their family members were all banned from entering China, Hong Kong, and Macau. And so this is an increasing issue, and many, it influenced a lot. Many students gave up their theme of dissertation, and some students, especially those from mainland China, they are not to choose a course, though they are very interested in that. And some students require to be anonymous when join a conversation or online class. I'll stop here and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Tang Biao. That's great and very, very clear. So now we're going to go to Eva.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andy, and thanks for the far too kind introduction, and thanks for including me on this panel. It's really great to be here. So we've heard a lot already, many examples, and much reflection on the current situation of people teaching China, engaging with China as researchers, and also some very powerful examples in China, but then also transnational academic repression experienced outside of China. And I think that what I would like to focus on in the very few minutes I've got is really how we can think about responding to these challenges. And I think that, and I should say that as a China scholar myself, of course, I've, all the experiences and examples you've given resonate with me, and also I find them very stimulating. But thinking about responses, I think that I would like to start by slightly cautioning against strong uses of this dichotomy between perpetrators and victim, and sort of active and passive modes that we sometimes find in the discussion of this issue. Of course, there can be victims of academic repression, also transnational academic repression. I think that Tong Biao has offered some very personal and very powerful examples, and also reminded us of the recent experience of Dr. Adrian Zenz, the well-known suspected international crime, where there are victims of this kind. I think it is, of course, really important to think about how to protect them, and also how the law can protect. There is agency on the sort of liberal democratic side of academic exchanges and collaboration with China. And people do get to make choices, but of course these choices are very often affected by the situation and the choices made by others. So self-censorship, I think, is a good example, and I would actually want to continue using that word, because I think it does capture a very important ethical dilemma. What do you do if you are asked to self-censor in order to protect a collaboration, an academic collaboration partner in China who might be put at risk, or feel they might be put at risk if you didn't self-censor? What do you do if asked to by a junior scholar or a would-be research student to lie to their government in order to protect their safety? I think that those kinds of situations do raise ethical dilemmas that we cannot dismiss. And I think that it is important to accept that precisely because repression works using fear, and precisely because fear clouds judgment, there is a range of responses we will get from different people who experience fear differently, and may have different considerations about their families, about their social environment, etc., that affect their choices. And as researchers, as scholars working on and with and partly in China, I think we are affected. We are sort of caught up in all of these very, very complex issues. And so I think that while I absolutely agree that there can be selfish self-censorship, there can be selfish choices, and choices that are, if you like, in ethical terms, unpardonable and attract blame, there's also a kind of altruistic self-censorship, a self-censorship that takes into consideration the situation of others, or that simply happens under enormous pressure, sometimes amounting to situations really similar to duress. And I think that from my perspective, that fact, as I see it, that sort of basic setting in which we find ourselves, calls for more thought about the ethics of complicity, the kinds of complicity with transnational academic repression that can arise. I think that it remains important to think about personal, individual ethical responsibility, about potential blame and guilt. But we need to go beyond that, not least because quite often when we get to make the decision to self-censor or not, to lie or not, it is already too late really to address the problem that we have become caught up in because of a long-standing, say, collaborative relationship that has already been established. And that means that we are involved and we are responsible for others who may be more at risk than we are. So I think that what we need to do is, to some extent at least, we need to shift away from a discourse entirely focused on blame of individuals or institutions, and towards a more sort of institutional and collective and political thinking about our responsibilities, thinkable or protect us against transnational academic repression. And we can do that, I would suggest, very, very loosely drawing on the work of Iris Marion Young on structural injustice. I would make two suggestions very, very briefly in this context. The first is in the sort of medium term. I do think that we actually need a lot more research. Some wonderful research has been done, not least by Rory Truax and his colleagues. There is the Academic Freedom Index, which I think is very, very helpful. Lots of research have been done, but more needs to be done, especially in my personal view, to understand how the structures, how the way that academia is structured and institutionalized in different systems in liberal democracies makes us more or less vulnerable. To give one example, I'm speaking to you from London, from the UK. Our academic institutions, our higher education is incredibly marketized, and that, in my view, has made us incredibly vulnerable. In the short term, some colleagues and some colleagues, including academic scholars, but also colleagues working in NGOs like the European CARA network and the NGO Scholars at Risk, have come up with a code of conduct that tries to identify a number of areas of concern that we need to pay attention to. The group calls itself the Academic Freedom and Internationalization Working Group. You can easily Google it. The code of conduct is a bit complex, but fundamentally what we're trying to call for is transparency as one concern. We need to have more transparency about, for instance, the terms of engagement and the kinds of risk that collaboration and exchange with repressive systems in this academic context can trigger. That is essential for enabling more scrutiny and ultimately potentially accountability. We need, in the run-up before exchange agreements and so on, we need to have proper due diligence. That due diligence has to involve area experts, area studies experts. It has to involve those who are affected by collaboration and exchange programs, rather than having these exchanges and programs decided by academic administrators who have very important functions, but often just don't understand the kinds of risk they are generating. And then I think also very importantly, we need to understand that we need to sort of realize and really respond to historical content. So that includes, of course, very, very importantly, from my perspective, anyone who, as a scholar or student, comes to our institutions, these days, I think, are facing potential risks of sort of transnational censorship, being put under pressure about what they say while here, perhaps even being put under pressure to report back about their experience, etc., etc. Very problematic. a very difficult experience. And we are calling for mechanisms of confidential consultation that would help address these kinds of dilemmas. But then there's also the dilemma and the very concerning situation of the person who comes here and finds themselves stigmatized and discriminated against just simply because they come from a particular repressive country. And I think that's a rising problem that we also need to address. And of course, we also have responsibilities towards scholars and students sort of going the other direction, who may be exposing themselves to risks that need to be properly assessed. They need to be managed so far as best we can. We need to take responsibility in the kinds of situation that Tongbia was getting at the end of his intervention. When scholars, for instance, find themselves suddenly excluded because their visas to China or any other country are denied, I think academia has a responsibility to accept that as a potential consequence of good scholarship, and to find mechanisms of support for scholars to whom this happens, because especially if it happens to an early career scholar, it is a very, very intimidating prospect, of course. So, of course, I would in no way suggest that a code of conduct, a mechanism of a bottom-up mechanism of self-regulation, merely identifying areas of concern and making promises about institutional change actually brings about any meaningful change just by itself. But I do think that trying to articulate standards that we can sort of collectively hold ourselves to is important as a kind of first step. And these standards can also be used by universities, by funding organizations, but also they can be used in the interaction with academic collaborators in autocratic systems and repressive systems as standards that have to be observed because they have been collectively accepted. So I will stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva. That's great. Ben, up to you.
Great, thanks. So thanks so much for including me as part of this important conversation. It's also great to have this opportunity to continue to honor Tim Gillat and all he contributed to the field before we lost him way too early. So I guess I want to add a few other thoughts. I mean, listening to the conversation so far, I'm also thinking about it's just a fairly stunning range of issues we all need to confront. And that itself raises complexities, I think, especially for junior colleagues in the field. I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute. So I want to just raise maybe 3 or 4 additional issues and obligations that haven't come up so far yet. I actually want to start with a comment about the situation here at home in the US, because I do think it's important at this moment for us to sort of reiterate the obligation that we all face to work to combat anti-Asian bias in this country, and in particular here in New York City. And I do think that we as scholars of China share a particular obligation to call out those who seek to take advantage of the worsening of US-China relations to target Asian Americans. Now, of course, you know, anti-Asian bias is just about as old as is this country, but we are in a particular moment where we are seeing a rise of anti-Asian violence and racism, some of which feeding on the narrative about China as well. And I think we just need to be conscious of that and also work against it. And this obligation really needs to be on all of us. And I think all of us would certainly agree that our institutions are so much stronger for having strong representation of students from Asia and also Asian Americans. But I think we've also realized over the last couple of weeks that many of our institutions have given far too little attention to this issue or taken far too few steps to fight anti-Asian bias here at home. But also, you know, that we all need to be speaking out when we perceive our own government-driven China policy, you know, to be targeting scholars based primarily on their race or their ties with China. So I'd urge, you know, those of you, I don't know if Maggie Lewis is on this call or not, but Maggie did a great event a couple of weeks ago, which is on YouTube, hosted, I think, at Princeton, on the FBI's China Initiative. And I just want to tip my hat to Maggie and urge folks on here to go back and watch that as well. But it's clear we need talking about a lot of different issues today, but we also need to seek out opportunities to better educate policymakers here in the US about why some of our own policies can at times be self-destructive. Second, I want to now shift and talk about interactions with and in China. And I just want to raise, we've been talking a lot about, how do we react here in our own classrooms? And I want to raise the question of how we ethically engage with China going forward. And in particular, the question of whether we can develop even rough guidelines for how we as scholars interact with China, and in particular institutions in China, if and when travel resumes. I think we all hope that at some point, not too far off, travel will resume. And so I guess what I'm trying to raise here is, I want to raise this question of what we do in China as opposed to how we react here. And I would say, I personally continue to be a deep believer in academic engagement with our Chinese colleagues. I think it's incredibly important to continue this engagement both here in the US and in China. We need scholarly discussions, in particular when our governments are barely talking to each other. And this is true, in areas obviously where maybe cooperation might be possible, climate change, public health, but also across the board, including in areas like law. I think this type of scholarly engagement is something we should be seeking to maintain and preserve. But the question is, how do we do this responsibly? And what do we do about events in China, for example, that are hosted by universities or organizations that either have very strong state ties or that have targeted individual academics, right? When does our engagement cross over into legitimization of official policies? And should we be, for example, shying away from interactions with certain institutions or universities in China that have terminated their faculty on the orders of the party, or that back up state repression in other ways? And so I guess what I want to say here is that there's no clear answers. I'm not going to sort of say I have the hidden recipe for good engagement, but I think there are also some things we can keep in mind as well. Right, so I think one suggestion is that we really focus on the scholarship. Smaller conferences are far more likely to be valuable than our large, high-profile international events hosted in China. I think most of us, certainly on speaking, and I think looking at the names, most folks who are listening probably also have a pretty good sense of when conferences and events in China are likely to be more show than substance. Small scale interactions of the type that I think US Asian Law Institute often does with legal scholars are great, where you get a small number of people in the room or on Zoom talking about a particular issue. That's great. And subject matter is important as well. We should be focusing in areas where cooperation or relatively open discussion is possible. I think this is also important. But mainly, I just want to suggest that we need to be continuing to ask this question: what types of scholarly interaction make the most sense right now and will make the most sense going forward? I just want to add maybe a footnote here that also there's increased complexity now where we have certain Chinese universities being put on the US government's entity list. And although my understanding is I'm not an export control lawyer, so this is not legal advice, but my understanding is that doesn't necessarily affect our ability to go and attend conferences at these universities. It does, again, make these issues more complex, and just the fact that many of us now, when we go to China, have to first talk to our own, legal departments at our universities, I think is something we didn't really think about just a few years ago. Then third, I want to pick up on something that I think has been said a little bit before, but raise it again and maybe frame it a little bit differently. The question I'd say is, how do we study a country that no longer wants to be studied? And also, in particular, how do we advise our students and our more junior colleagues about how to navigate, this project of studying China in an era in which China's attitude towards foreign scholars has dramatically shifted? The easiest way to put this is to say that we're at a moment where traditional methods that have dominated in sort of China studies fields writ large, most notably qualitative fieldwork, simply may not be possible anymore. I think that's probably the case. And so this sort of leads us, I think, into two different directions in terms of how we talk about this. One is, how do we talk about the data we're now using to study China? There's lots of public data available in China. That gives rise to challenges as well. And I think most people on this call will be aware that maybe we shouldn't take public data at face value. But I also just want to flag that there's a huge amount of scholarship coming out both from China and outside of China using public data that I think doesn't do enough to challenge the quality of that data. So that's sort of one set. What are our new sets of data? But I think the related set, and again, this is something that I think Rory and Ava have both raised already. The related question is, how do we guide our students towards academic careers in which research is going to be far harder to conduct than it was for all of us, right? How do we advise them about the risks of doing field work, even if they are able to travel to China? And again, obviously, Andy's on this panel. This is not a new issue. This is not a new risk. And I'd love to actually, Andy's the moderator, but I just want to invite Andy to comment on this as well. And of course, we know China scholars have long been creative, right? Still much easier to get information about China now than it was for our predecessors in the 1960s when they were relying largely on interviewing, refugees fleeing China to Hong Kong. We have a lot of new tools, but I do think it's important to recognize we're at a moment where how we study China probably is going to change fairly dramatically. And I'll just put a shout out. Rory actually had a great Twitter post on this yesterday, so I'm not going to say what it was. I'll welcome Rory to jump in. But many of us have really benefited from a 20 or 30-year period in which China was remarkably open to foreign scholars. And that's obviously, although obviously not to all of Andy's experiences show, but this year clearly may be changing. And we need to think hard about how we guide, train, and support our students, and in particular, junior scholars who are pre-tenure. And I just want to say that I think an important part of this is I want to reiterate something I think Rory pointed out, but it's really important that we also educate our colleagues not in the China field about this, because I think as we're hearing in our call today, one of the things I was thinking about is, gosh, there's a lot of issues we all have to think about, and these put a particular burden on our students and junior colleagues. And I think just we need to do a much better job of educating, colleagues who don't study China about the complexities of studying China today, especially for folks who are early in their career, because I do not think these complexities are fully appreciated. And then I'll also say, obviously, the China's sanctions against Merrick's and others, against China scholars in Europe this week, raises the question of how we best stand with our colleagues who are being targeted, and what we can do also to encourage our institutions to respond, because I think as many of us know, institutional responses in support of scholars who've been targeted by the Chinese government have not always been as strong as many of us would like to see. And then finally, I think I'm out of time. I just want to say one final thing. So Professor Alvarez raised a really interesting question in the chat about sort of, how do we advise our students going to China or studying in China? And we have programs in China. And maybe we can get to that in a minute. I want to raise another issue, which is just to say that I think, lots of us are at institutions that have a footprint in China. Those footprints differ in the shape they take. Some are, like NYU, an actual campus. Some are like Columbia, just an office. But I just want to say, I have the sense that too often when we focus on risks to operating in China, we focus almost exclusively on the experience of our students, or what happens when our professors go over there. I just want to put in a plea that we also think about the experience, the interests of our staff on the ground in China, who are working really hard in many cases to further academic interactions, but who also at times put themselves at risk in order to further the interests of our universities. And I think sometimes we don't pay as much attention to their interests and their concerns as we need to do as well. So I'll stop there. I think there is plenty for us to discuss as we open it up to broader conversation.
Ben, thank you. This has just been a wonderful panel. And I want to hear from Jerry in a moment, but it seems to me there's as I said at the beginning, that it seems to me all ethical dilemmas involve trade-offs between or among things that are good. But some of the ethical dilemmas are easier to resolve than others. So for example, Rory's presentation, which is very thoughtful and very important, and I'm grateful to you and your colleagues for having done it. Nonetheless, what you've come up with, I think it's easy for all of us to sort of say, you're right. The importance of academic freedom and intellectually valid teaching is uppermost, and then we take ameliorative measures to reduce the costs, and it's not really a painful trade-off. The things we do to ameliorate are tolerable. But a lot of the ethical dilemmas that we face are truly, truly painful. So, and I would give my own example, by the way, of being banned as one that was not a big deal, because I had tenure, which tells you the importance of tenure. And so it's kind of an easy choice. But the university is a gigantic enterprise, and it has many, many relations with China that are valuable, constructive, both for China or for the world when we're doing, various kinds of scientific research and so forth. And at the same time, there's, going to be one or two of us who get in trouble in the university. Do we think so? It might seem that the easy answer is that Columbia should, ban everything to do with China because China bans Andy Nathan. I myself don't agree with that. And I think that, it's more of a painful trade-off. I think the Confucius Institutes for many institutions are a similar case where they need the money, and the Confucius Institute isn't really doing anything that bad. Ben raised the question of, do we collaborate? When do we continue to collaborate with Chinese colleagues or institutions? How bad does it have to be before we cut off all collaboration? All these, advising our students to sort of self-censor, or Ezra Vogel's famous controversial decision to allow his biography of Deng Xiaoping to be published with some cuts. It's a real trade-off, and his reason for allowing that was, because he wanted the rest of the book to be available to Chinese readers. So I think it's most of the problems are, only a few of them are relatively clear and easy, and most of them are extraordinarily difficult. So I see that the Q&A tab is full of really, really extraordinarily thoughtful questions. And I also see the picture of Jerry Cohen on my screen. Hi, Jerry.
Hi.
So I don't need to keep on blathering when we have Jerry to tell us the answer to these questions.
This is a fabulous program. It is a wonderful tribute to Tim Gillette. He would have been thrilled to be here and to listen to these various stimulating viewpoints. As Andy said at the outset, Tim was my student. He was my law firm associate. We worked together on publishing things. He taught at NYU as an adjunct. He was one of the most intense scholars and lawyers I've ever known. He could negotiate contracts, settle disputes in English, French, and Chinese. And he was a constant goad to me to keep up with human rights, even while trying to practice law. So I have a set of questions for the panel, and these are not abstract academic. These are questions I confront in my daily life. First, there are questions, of course, about the ethical dilemmas for foreign scholars. When some of us criticize China's human rights violations, some people in America and elsewhere say, we're poisoning the climate for improving Sino-American relations. These are one-sided criticisms, and we should moderate what we say. The second dilemma, of course, is should we support objective Chinese criticisms of American and other governments' violations of human rights? We are criticized because they say, if we say China has some credibility in some of its attacks, that we're giving the communists the rope to hang the capitalists. We just heard that in the Wall Street Journal again the other day. Third dilemma, and this is very personal, is to what extent is it worthwhile and appropriate to go on taking part in conferences with China, academic conferences, track 2, political legal dialogues? Is it a waste of time? Does it depend on the subject? I find personally human rights discussions with China in recent years are not very valuable, even though in coffee and tea breaks, friends on the Chinese side may whisper what they think. On the other hand, if we have a dialogue about the legal and political problems of the South China Sea or the East China Sea, I find those discussions are still worthwhile. And of course, I don't take part any longer in the economic discussions. But is it a waste of time, or is it important to give support by taking part in these meetings to those colleagues on the other side whom we have requested to participate, even though in the meetings they're not free to speak out? So that's really a question. I rationalize so far my continuing participation because it's good for my Chinese language to hear them speak. But that's pretty narrow and personal satisfaction. Finally, I'm really delighted to hear from my colleague and friend Teng Biao focus on the ethical dilemmas for Chinese scholars. I have sometimes been openly critical in forums in China and Hong Kong about the failure of many of China's great legal experts to speak out against the abuses in practice that the regime engages in. They are afraid of losing their influence in drafting and influencing important legislation that may not be followed today, but at least sets goals for the future. And that's a very important role that no one else will play. On the other hand, their quiet failure to criticize the attacks on colleagues like Teng Biao and others has been very discouraging. And maybe I've been too tough on them. Maybe I haven't sufficiently considered their own dilemmas and their value. Finally, I would just say scholars are luckier than lawyers. I left practice happily 20 years ago when I could have continued because I felt I wasn't totally free. I was responsible for a large group of people in a law firm successfully doing business with China, and it was beginning to have an adverse reaction. So as a scholar, one is to be free. And I realize it's easier for a senior older scholar to speak out than it is for the students and the young teachers in this field. So this is a wonderful program. I'd love to hear some comments on the questions I have raised. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Jerry. Does anybody want to address any of Jerry's questions? And after that, we'll ask Catherine to feed us some of the Q&A because I see that there are a lot of great questions in the Q&A. A panel like this is a success when it raises a host of questions, even if we don't get any answers. But if there are some answers, who would like to address some of the things Jerry said? When do we stop seeking to collaborate with Chinese scholars and institutions? How bad does it have to be?
I'll call her back.
Hello.
Tang Biao, do you want to address that? When would you advocate that American-based scholars just say, I refuse to collaborate with any Chinese institution or scholar. I'm not going to meet with them. We cannot. After Tiananmen in 1989, there was a strong wave of advocacy. We should cut off academic exchanges with China. Should we have done so at that time, or now, or soon?
Thank you for the questions and comments. So my take is we have to evaluate that case by case, maybe. The money from the Chinese government, in principle, I think the Western universities and the think tanks should reject the money directly from the Chinese government and its affiliations. But some are not so clear. Some foundations have connections with Chinese government, more or less, like Dong Jianhua Foundation, the former chief executive of Hong Kong, and many other, the Tsai, the vice head of Alibaba. So I think the American universities should be very, very careful to accept their donation, and to cooperate with Chinese scholars and the Chinese institutions. Of course, we don't need to cut off all the connections, and we should play a role in spreading the information and encourage the independent thinking and research of the Chinese scholars. But as I have discussed a little bit, we should be aware of the nuanced discussion of different level of self-censorship. Some self-censorship is understandable or even necessary. Some are not acceptable, not necessary. Jerry mentioned the human rights violations. So if you keep silent for some human rights violations, and in order to continue research or to protect your personal safety or your students' safety, that's totally fine, okay. But like the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang, if you are a scholar on Chinese Muslim on religious freedom, and you keep totally silent in order not to be banned from traveling to Xinjiang, and so that kind of trade-off is not reasonable. So what's happening is genocide, and that's not a regular the human rights violation. Yeah, so that's my idea.
Thanks. That's very useful. Catherine, do you want to shoot the panel some questions?
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to say before I begin the questions how excited I am to hear everybody's contributions. Jerry said that for him some of these questions are very personal, and I can tell from what people have said that that is true for everyone here, and it's certainly true for me. The reason I wanted to have this panel was this is like a dream group, a lineup of people to help me think through the questions that I'm constantly reflecting on in my own life and work. Not that we'll come out at the end of this discussion with clear answers, but it is ever so helpful to have the input of everyone. And I just want to say quickly two things. One is, in the context of the conversations that we at the US Asia Law Institute have on a weekly basis, we have speaker programs, we have people coming and talking about all kinds of topics related to Asia and law, domestic law, international law. A recurring theme that may seem very different from this topic, but I think is actually, I think I see a connection, is the extent to which China's engagement in the world, at the level that it is now engaging, its involvement as an economic player, political player, military, to what extent is it bringing something completely new, something that has not been done by other actors, or to what extent is it simply doing something that others have done, but because it is such a big country, because it is 1.3 billion people with such a large economy, it is more visible, it has more impact. And we've asked ourselves, as in other institute programs, we've raised the question, China's actions at the WTO, are they unique, or is it just that it's China rather than a smaller country that's doing them that gets our attention and has bigger impact? Or China's actions with respect to other aspects of international law, the way it behaves in forums, is it really that different, or is it just that it's this large, powerful actor that does have so much influence? And so in the similar way, a question that I've been asking, and I want to just comment, is I wonder to what extent what China is doing now is qualitatively or quantitatively or either or both different from what other governments have tried to do. It's just that China has unique tools now at its disposal, social media, digital tools that enable it. And also it has the financial means to exact a price, to penalize. So as you were saying at the beginning, Andy, about being able to try to control the discourse. I mean, all governments want to control discourse and the way they're seen in the world. Is it just that China has more tools at its disposal and is more motivated to do so than other countries? So I just throw that as a thought. And another concern that I have is groupthink, and the harm that we may be doing by even having a conversation like this. I think Ben was the one who used the term stigmatizing. I mean, this context of not wanting to stigmatize people, researchers who come from China, students from China, Chinese Americans, others of Chinese ethnicity or other Asians. We certainly don't want to do that. We don't want to exaggerate the problem. We don't want to make the problem seem more serious than it is, and therefore scare people away. Like the danger sign on the thin ice when the ice isn't that thin, maybe. Does the conversation in itself do harm? And do we create a kind of groupthink within the academy where we start to reach a sort of consensus about how we should approach the problem of China? And one reason I think of this is because I've recently been reading a book about the China field in the 60s and 70s. It's looking back at the Committee of Concerned Scholars, which certainly Jerry will and Andy Nathan will remember very well. When I entered the China field, it was already receding in importance because the Vietnam War had ended, but it definitely helped to reshape the way that the US Academy looked at China, changed, shook up China studies. And there is this question about the extent to which a particular field or group of scholars do develop a groupthink. And this can be constricting. The committee, the Concerned Scholars, the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars was trying to disrupt a groupthink with respect to China that had prevailed since the McCarthy period, which created another kind of groupthink. So I just want to say that I think we want to beware anything that would seem to move in that direction at all. And that is one of my greatest concerns when I start thinking about these topics. So,
so Eva, I think Eva had something to contribute, and then we'll go back to the Q&A. Eva?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you. I mean, very quickly, if I may, actually, on on Catherine's qualitative, sort of quantitative point, I mean, I have to say, in my view, when we look to what happens in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the technically supported crimes against humanity, potential genocide that is happening, I do think that that is a stepping up of repression that is remarkable, even in the context of China. And I do feel very strongly that it needs to be called out, and that is the point that I wanted to get back to. One of the wonderful points that Jerry made. Namely, sort of, can we criticize, when we criticize China, is there sort of, how about criticizing other governments for their human rights violations? I mean, I have to say that I think often that question sort of is raised more as a kind of concern about whataboutism, namely this idea that we can't criticize China because of human rights violations happening elsewhere. And we should reject that very, very flawed argument. But I think equally, and because we should reject that flawed argument, we also have to reject the idea that in raising justified criticism of human rights violations elsewhere, we're somehow making somebody else's argument. That doesn't make sense to me. And that gets very much back to what Catherine was also talking about. I think that as scholars, we just have an obligation to try and call out, to speak to the issues where we have expertise, and if that happens to be human rights, then call out human rights violations wherever they happen. I don't think there's any way around that. And I would personally want to trust our ability as a community of academics, of people thinking critically, to tease out the nuances and to respect, to live with disagreement and work with disagreement on these issues. And I think that the danger of groupthink, for instance, about China, of some sort of new Cold War thinking, doesn't come so much from within academia, so far as I can see, but more from sort of politics. And I think that academics can play a really constructive and role and have a responsibility to contribute to the discussion, precisely because of that danger.
Great, thank you.
Andy, can I just jump in with one quick comment? Just because I want to push back against the frame which was suggested to have grown out of my comments, that when does it become so bad, right? I mean, I think that I don't think I was suggesting that, okay, this is just it's at some point things get so bad that we shut it off. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think the way to think about it is, how do we ethically engage? What are the subjects where we can actually have productive conversations? And at the same time, right, how do we continue to do programming here and educate our students and colleagues about the situation in China? So I guess I just am uncomfortable with the idea that, okay, it's the postulating that at some point it might be so bad we just shut it off. I actually think, especially as U.S.-China relations get worse, we need to continue to find ways to engage. I'm just arguing for being smarter and being really conscious about the types of events we're participating in.
All right, let's see what the Q&A have to say.
Yeah. So the question of the sanctions against MERIX, which is one of Europe's leading think tanks working on China, this has already been briefly mentioned, but one of the questions focuses very much on this and says that apparently there are reports that already some other researchers and institutions are breaking their ties to MERIX and seeking to distance themselves from MERIX, omitting internships with MERIX from their CVs, for example, chambers of commerce making sure that researchers that work with them do not have a connection to MERIX, and so on. So how do we respond to this is the question.
So I wonder if we could have an arrangement that each question is addressed by only one panelist so we can get more questions in. And since Rory, if you want to, I don't want to push, since you are the only panelist who hasn't had a second remark so far, you want to take a shot at this one?
I mean, I think there's a couple things to think about with the Merrick sanctions. I mean, to my knowledge, and I'm happy to be educated and corrected on this, this does represent a real escalation on the part of the Chinese government actually sanctioning a think tank, which in my opinion is not a particularly controversial or highly critical think tank of China. I might be wrong, but it's interesting that they're targeting this think tank. And I think it's the first potentially of many, right? So it's not going to stop here. I think that's important to keep in mind. In terms of the individual researchers omitting Merricks from their CV, I would not personally do that, but I'm also not going to judge anybody for what they do to try to protect themselves, given the circumstances. So I think we shouldn't blame the victim here. But I think, ideally what we would have is a situation where when Merricks gets sanctioned, other institutions are responding in kind, right? So an affront to Merricks is an affront to CSIS, it's an affront to Princeton, it's an affront to Columbia. We need coordination. And there's a pattern in the China field where institutions cross the Chinese government and they face an individual price, and that's that. And other institutions don't really do much in the way of coming to their defense. And I think we're probably at the time where Western academic and research institutions that interface with China need some sort of at least a shared statement of principles, but it may be even a shared response when this sort of things happen. Otherwise, it's just going to keep happening. So I'm in favor of collective action, but also knowing full well that getting academic institutions to cooperate is quite difficult.
So if there were a think tank code of conduct around things like this, and there are other examples such as a think tank presenting a list of names to a Chinese organization and that organization saying we can't have this or that person, what would the response be by the coordinated think tank community to this action?
Well, and I get to go with your analogy. I remember on some trips that I have been on where individual scholars will have visa issues, the response has been, well, if one of the people in our delegation is not allowed to go, the entire delegation won't go. And so, the Chinese government still does want to have relationships with Western institutions and Western academic institutions. And so canceling conferences, canceling exchanges, I think we'd have to think more. There's always this question of what is the teeth? What exactly is the response that will make a difference? And it can't just be a statement of solidarity. So I think that's something that needs to be mulled over further. But I think the general principle of you target one person, we all have a response. I think that's the way to start thinking about it.
So Ben, you're in favor of exchanges. It's not a black and white thing, but should CFR, CSIS, Brookings, and so on and so forth say, well, then none of us is going to go to China and we're not inviting you to us either, and you can't speak at our institution and we won't speak at yours?
Yeah, so I don't think shutting down all sort of conversation. First of all, I've never been in the think tank world, so I'm probably more comfortable talking about universities than I am about think tanks. But I think, the response should be more like attending Merrick's events, inviting Merrick's folks to participate at our events. That's where we need to see the class. I mean, I'll say this, I've spoken to Merrick's before. I thought it was a great interaction. So I just think, the response has got to be to just continue to engage also with those folks who have been targeted by China. I think that's the strongest type of response we can have.
Some people are putting comments and questions in the chat, but you better put them in the Q&A if you want to have a chance for Catherine to see them. Catherine, do you want to go to another?
Yeah, there's a question here also very dear to my heart. Can the panel speak to the Academy's responsibilities to the public? So far, we've mostly focused on scholars' impacts on themselves, their own research, and of course on students, on junior colleagues. Ben rightly pointed out that there are staff on the ground. But what about the public as one of our constituencies? And how can we be open and honest about developments in China and dispel the flood of disinformation being propagated. And here I would say disinformation from all sides, right? And just confusion, noise, without exacerbating the anti-Asian sentiment that a number of people have also already talked about. So this is a huge question.
I think Ben has already said something about it, and I'm tempted to ask Teng Biao whether you think that we as China specialists in the United States should try to sort of say that China's not that bad, kind of a thing, and try to sort of counteract the sort of anti-China hysteria that's being built up by, I think, as Eva said, by politicians.
First, I agree what several panelists have mentioned. We are not against the Chinese people. We are not against China. We should reject that kind of narrative. But at the same time, I argue that we should have more strict scrutiny on Chinese money, the Confucius Institute, and the CSSA, Chinese Scholars and Students Associations, like Chinese propaganda machine, and so the Xinhua News Agency and the Global Times, and some scholars, some Chinese think tanks and scholars, visiting scholars, they are part of the propaganda machine. So we should make more effort to combat the disinformation campaign behind, in the name of academic research or media. So it. And of course, the disinformation is a big problem in many countries, and not only from China, but here it's really a severe problem. The China scholars have responsibility to fight against.
Eva, let me ask you, some people say that as scholars, we should be strictly academic. We should not spend our time denouncing, human rights violations or taking a position on whether Xinjiang is genocide or not genocide, because it's important that we keep our purity and credibility as academics, something that you and I have not done. What is your position on that?
Oh dear, Andy. So I think that all the questions that you just mentioned are, of course, questions of scholarly inquiry and discussion, and as, for instance, legal scholars in political science, international relations, and so on. I think that we absolutely do have to contribute to these discussions. I guess that what I find interesting about this question, and I hope I'm not misreading it, and forgive me if I am, but in some ways, this is exactly the kind of distinction that I came across when I started looking at the situation of human rights defenders in China, where essentially the contrast that was drawn was between people who were just doing their job as lawyers, keeping strictly to the letter of the law on the one hand, and then these radicals, these Weiquan human rights defenders, who were being politicized and addressing the bigger issues and somehow just not doing their job. But it turned out that, at least in my analysis, the latter group, of course, was doing very, very important although also extremely dangerous work, and Teng Biao was an important example of that. I feel, so my response to the question is that I think we actually need to resist the attempt, the psychological effect of this attempt to distinguish between legitimate and somehow not so legitimate expression and scholarly work, I think it was something that scholars should address. And going back to the previous question, I think that that's exactly where I think we have a responsibility to complicate the understanding of China and an opportunity to show that and actors and that it is not that we should resist a simplistic sort of friend-enemy perception of China as well.
Great. Catherine?
Yeah. Here's a topic that hasn't really come up yet, and that's foreign academics who accept visiting positions at Chinese universities. Is it realistic to think that as a foreign citizen, you can teach freely enough to benefit the students you work with at limited risk to yourself? What about the risk to those you teach or to the Chinese scholars who sponsored your appointment? And the question goes on, for argument's sake, let's say that sensitive issues are not at the center of what you are teaching, but are bound to come up at some point, and that the Chinese people who offer you the position are well aware of what you say and write while in the West, and that the institution in question is not, as far as you know, particularly involved in repression. Just to sort of take some distracting points off the table.
So there's individual professors who accept the visiting appointment. There is also the NYU in Shanghai or something, and Rory has a program. I don't know what it is. A study, probably is it a language program? So maybe Ben and maybe Ben could pick this up first. And Jerry, I don't know if you want to say something about NYU in Shanghai, and Rory about what your program is, violating my rule that one question has one responder. Ben.
I was going to let Jerry go first. So,
okay, Jerry, NYU in Shanghai, good, bad?
You know, in the late 80s, I tried to persuade the NYU Law School faculty to set up an LLM program in both Shanghai and Beijing. And it was a divisive question. And in the end, despite some strong faculty support, including from our then Dean, John Sexton, I withdrew it and took part in the Temple program instead in Beijing. But then when John became president of NYU, he had this great idea at a time when it seemed optimistic and possible to have a free foreign academic outpost, a branch in China as in other countries. NYU went into this. It has been increasingly difficult, of course, despite great leadership on the part of the NYU people and some good cooperation from people in China, to carry on as freely as possible. But they continue. I admire the effort. I don't agree with every step or PR release they've made, but generally I think it's extremely important to keep up this cooperation. It may not be tenable for too long if the current trend in China increases. I want to say more broadly about the questions of individual people going to teach in China. I have found very interesting Peter Hessler's occasional articles about his experience teaching in Chengdu. And we learn a lot from that. And I think his New Yorker articles help us reflect on the complexity of interaction with Chinese students and with the broader community.
Ben?
Yeah, so thank you, Jerry. I mean, that's really not excellent. And I guess I would sort of echo what Jerry said and say, I think it would be a real shame if we got to a point where, Americans couldn't or didn't feel safe going to China to teach, because I think there is so much value that comes from these interactions. genuinely, but there obviously are concerns, and there obviously have scholars who've had to leave also. I'm well aware of that. I guess I want to answer this partially by answering Catherine's prior question. This is like a move from the Sunday morning talk shows, right? You answer the prior question. But I want to say that I think when we talk about public education, we shouldn't rule out public education in China. Now, of course, the publics we talk to in China may be elites, and we all know that. I mean, if you're speaking or talking or teaching in English, that may be different. But I just want to put in a plug also for continuing to talk to Chinese audiences. We've seen pretty high take-up rates of events we've geared to our Beijing Center on issues like public health, climate change. I did a talk in December on legal issues in the American presidential transition. Obviously, those of us who can do this in Chinese, that's better. You can reach more people. But I think there's, we should also think at this moment about how we continue to engage, even if in my case, it's areas not in my expertise. But when we think about reaching out to the public to talk more in this particularly fraught moment, there still remain opportunities, I think, to reach, if not the public, generally certain sectors of the public in China. I think we should seize on those as well. And I think that's the same point about teaching in China, right? There is real value that come from those interactions. And I think at the end of the day, it's probably an individual choice for every person as to sort of what's their both safety calculus and also how far do they feel like they have to go in restricting what they say, which often you can't really figure out till you get on the ground and actually start teaching.
Rory, do you want to talk about your program?
Are you referring to like Princeton and Beijing? Or are you referring to?
I think I am. Well, a program that it says in your bio that you started.
Oh, well, once upon a time, I was 19 and taught English in China, which is what one did. So I can talk about that. But no, I would just reiterate.
Princeton in Asia Summer of Service.
Yeah, Princeton in Asia. I've been involved with Princeton in Asia, and also I did Princeton in Beijing. And I would say just a couple things for folks keeping in mind. First, people need to know what they're getting into. And I think this goes back to Tung Biao's point about some self-censorship is necessary and acceptable. And every single foreigner who walks into China is self-censoring in some way. We don't all run around speaking our minds about the Chinese government when we're there. And that doesn't mean that those exchanges and interactions aren't valuable. And I think the criterion for a good teaching position or a relationship should never be, can I completely, is there full freedom of speech at this institution? Because I think that will likely, get off the table most academic exchanges with China. I think you would also be surprised. I have friends who are working at places like NYU Shanghai or have guest taught at Schwartzman and places like this. I think there is a lot more space than I think a lot of people would imagine sitting here in the West. And so I'm in favor of these sorts of exchanges. I just think the individual needs to be aware of what they're getting themselves into, and also work to not put other people at risk through their own activities and their own work there.
Jerry, you want to?
Andy, yeah. I just wanted to say there are also ways when you're speaking to an audience in China, even if you say some tough things, of trying also to make some verbal concessions. I have found, for example, if I quote Deng Xiaoping, sure, Cho, sure, let's face the facts. Or if I say at the end of a talk, 明天会更好, tomorrow will be even better, invoking a popular song. It softens the audience outlook, even if it doesn't change their views.
Okay, let's go to another question.
Yeah. So this has to do with whether the scholars in a university who are China specialists should be reaching out to the fundraisers, the development offices of the universities, those who are raising money for things like STEM research, public health research, not for China studies, to talk about some of these ethical questions. Are there issues that the development office should be aware of, and that we as China specialists can help them to understand? And I think this goes back, Andy, to something you were saying before about how universities are just huge institutions, especially, NYU, Columbia, where, yes, what happens to you as a China scholar is quite likely unknown to the development office several blocks away that is trying to raise funding for some complicated STEM research project. So what should the China scholars be doing to reach out to educate their colleagues on campus?
Yeah, and even if they knew and cared what was happening to me, would that mean they shouldn't do the stem cell or geological research and so forth? Eva, did you want to comment on that?
I did. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that absolutely there should be some communication. We need to establish communication with these fundraisers and across the university campus. I think that the problem in my experience, and I think that reflects the experience of several others, is that it's actually quite difficult to get anyone to listen, especially, for instance, in the university administration, because fundamentally what we're trying to tell them about, and when I say we, I mean China scholars, but of course it's also other area studies potentially. We're going to tell them about problems, new problems that they perhaps rather ignore, while busily raising funds and setting up programs and so on and so forth. And that is a real institutional challenge. And that, going back to what Rory said earlier on, I would fully echo that. We really need collective action. And I think that actually also, gosh, I'm now extending this exercise and going back to the previous point, but I think it does refer to the previous point of the scholar who is sent, the young person who is going to China to teach. I think that I fully agree that it's important for them to get that opportunity, and all sorts of good may come from the opportunity. But I think we need to get a little bit more organized and intelligent about how we prepare people who go. And we can't sort of entirely leave the discovery that there is censorship and there are risks to chance. And that too requires collective action. It requires organization and some sort of institutionalized process, from my perspective, however boring that may sound, for assessing the risks.
Thank you.
That we are addressing them.
Sorry, Eva, from time to time you freeze and then I thought you were done, so I just cut in there, but okay. Catherine?
Yeah, a new topic. Several people have asked about student informants or student spies in the classroom. Now, we know that this is done in Chinese classrooms in China. It's not, of course, framed as a spy or an informant. It's framed completely in a different light. But this is something that actually is, I think, mentioned, Eva, in that code of conduct that you helped work on. Are there known cases of this happening on U.S. campuses? Have any of the professors actually experienced this in your classrooms? And if so, how have you dealt with it? How should a university deal with it? It's not illegal to tell somebody outside the classroom what's going on inside the classroom. What should a professor do? What should a university do?
So Eva, you were called upon.
Yeah, I can.
Yes, and then Tung Bia. Eva?
Yeah. And so very, very briefly, I mean, I think that there are such situations. I think that there's a lot of anxiety about the fact that we know the systems, the institutionalized systems for recruitment of student informants exist. And because of anecdotal reports of some cases, this is a problem on everyone's minds. In my view, universities should have policies clarifying that at the hour of reporting should not happen and will not be tolerated, but also at the same time, students or scholars do report. They may do that under a grade of pressure, and that must inform the way we deal with the problem if we do become aware of it. So we shouldn't sort of just entirely condemn and blame people without trying to understand the situation that gave rise to this kind of.
The question is about reporting on other students. Am I right?
Well, it's not specific. I mean, there are two people who raised this question, and they weren't specific about the reporting, but it could be what other students say. It could be what the professor says.
Because I think reporting on what the professor says to me is okay. The professor said it, and he's professing it. But Tang Biao?
Okay, I agree.
Tang Biao?
Yeah, that's a big problem in China, but also a problem in American classrooms when there are more than one Chinese student. So what the Chinese students in the West fear most is the other Chinese students reporting their discussions, their speech point of views. Especially the students and scholars associations. So I had experienced that my panel was canceled because the CSSA students reported in advance, and then the Chinese consulate gave pressure to that university. Yeah, and that fear is real, and so because of that, an average Chinese student knows that, and then they are reluctant to register my cause or to raise issues in the classroom.
Jerry, you wanted to say?
Yeah, this reminds me of problems we had in the 70s. I used to run a weekly program at Harvard inviting luminaries, democratic figures from East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan. There weren't many opportunities to get people direct from China. And we were always monitored. The consulates of South Korea and the Republic of China, Taiwan, were always there. And they had their own agents in the audience. And I had to plead with people at the outset as they prepared to hear Kim Dae-jung or some other great figure. This time, listen carefully, report it correctly, because there were incorrect reports about what he said should US troops withdraw from South Korea, etc. From a personal point of view, since I no longer have contact with Chinese leaders, I welcome if there's secret police listening to what I say. It's my only way possibly to get communication up to the leadership. But it has a very bad effect, of course, on the classroom and on other public discussions.
Rory?
Thank you. I did want to weigh on in this with just maybe potentially a contrarian take, which is, I think we all agree that this is a problem. We don't know its severity. We don't know how many students are doing this. We don't know to what extent they're doing this. And I think there's a danger here if universities overemphasize this issue and kind of proffer this narrative that Chinese students are informing on you, Chinese students are informing on each other. There's already a narrative that Chinese students are spies for the Chinese government and stealing American technology. And so sometimes and what exactly are we supposed to do with that type of information? If there's sort of if you see something, say something type mentality where we're supposed to be monitoring our students for their monitoring and then trying to report them. It's one of those problems that's actually quite difficult to solve, even though we all acknowledge that it's a problem. And sometimes I actually worry that overemphasizing it might make it worse and breed an environment of stigmatization and self-censorship. And so we had an event at Princeton on Hong Kong, which Tang Biao was there, if I remember correctly, where there seemed to be evidence that there was some monitoring maybe going on, but definitely some mobilization going on. And it's always hard to tell when you see a lot of patriotic young Chinese citizens, is that mobilization authentic or organic, coming from within, or is it tied to the consulate or the embassy in some way? And my feeling is, again, like, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to crack down on that type of behavior, or just allow it and sort of potentially instruct those students about the proper way to engage in the open society? So I'm actually of the belief that a a lot of the kind of narrative about mobilization and monitoring, while it is true, there's some degree of this, I think an overreaction is also something we need to be worried about.
So Ben and Eva want to speak, and we have only 5 or 6 minutes left. So and we want to hear Jerry at the end, I think, right, Catherine? So this will probably be our last question. Do you think so, Catherine? So let's have Ben.
So I'll just be quick. I'm sort of saying the similar thing to what Rory said, but a different side, which is absolutely, if there's a problem, we should deal with it. But this narrative of Chinese students are spies is also one of the things that's fueling a lot of the anti-Chinese racism in the United States right now. And so I just think it's important to shift from framing, oh, are Chinese students spies, to like, what are the actual problems? What is the actual evidence? Like, let's look at it. I think the FBI has not been helpful on this by fueling this idea that Chinese students are spies. Most of the convictions they've gotten are for lying to the FBI, not for spying. And so, one of the participants in the chat pointed out, right? Obviously, there's a FARA violation if you're acting on behalf of a foreign state without being registered. So I just think we have to be really clear-eyed about what's going on, and then and not sort of over sensationalize it as well, because of the external risks if this get manipulated by people, seeking to further their racist agendas. The second thing I want to say is we should talk about what are the practical things we can do. This goes back to what Rory said at the start, right? I mean, my class has a rule it's a Las Vegas rule. What's said in the classroom stays in the classroom. Is it enforceable? No, but I mean, I think it's actually sets a tone that we expect you not to talk outside the classroom about what's said in this classroom without permission. I do not record any of my classes on China. There's become a norm about, and again, like could somebody at home record right now? Of course they could, but I still think, what I'm really concerned about is creating a situation in which students feel comfortable participating and setting norms that say, we don't talk about what's said in class outside the class. We don't record the class. I think those things can all help to advance. I've actually been pleasantly surprised with the level of conversation we get even in classes about China.
Eva?
So I think that signaling that what is said in the classroom stays in the classroom is precisely the kind of policy that we need to adopt in order to alleviate concerns. And I wanted to go back to what Tongbao said. It is often Chinese students themselves who are particularly afraid of being spied on. And I think that pushing slightly sort of back against what Rory said and Ben said, we have to keep that in mind as well. So we have to, I think, sort of take up responsibility for these students who might be otherwise self-censoring. And I think that it is important to consider the possibility of confidential mechanisms, some sort of ombudsperson within the university. I think that one of the ways of addressing it is by clarifying that when we think about these big issues of engaging with academics and students from repressive countries, we're not thinking about just one country. And I think our guidelines and policies and so on should make that clear, that of course this is about China, but it's not only about China. And I think that can help sort of alleviate this concern that we're stigmatizing people just because they're Chinese, which of course we don't want to do.
Tongbao, we only have 2 minutes left.
Yeah,
so
and I have a half minute, sorry. These Chinese students are not professional spies. I think most of them are not. But the Chinese consulates creates a kind of a atmosphere to encourage every Chinese student to report. Yes, that's a problem, and I agree we should not overact, and that's related to the NYU Shanghai and Johns Hopkins and Duke University in Kunshan. So that kind of atmosphere that make Chinese students silent, and so when these universities argue that they can enjoy academic freedom in China, even though Chinese people don't enjoy free speech, that seems not justifiable, because there is no the free discussion in the classrooms these Western universities in mainland China.
Well, I want to thank, first of all, the audience. We had a very distinguished audience and they raised great questions, a lot of great questions, and we only got to a few of them. Secondly, thank the 4 panelists who were superb and nuanced, thoughtful, and informed, and Catherine for organizing this, and US Asia Law Institute for organizing it, and finally, Jerry, for your valuable participation. And we want to hear your encouraging words at the end.
Well, we could go on with this fascinating and important topic, but let me just get practical in thanking everyone. 2 suggestions, of course. I hope we will be able to get copies in print of the introductory remarks that each of the speakers, including Andy, has made. And second, the recording should be widely distributed, because this was a terrific program and it should be open to many other people than the 100-odd people who had the opportunity to hear it live.
Catherine?
Okay, so I can assure you, Jerry, that we do plan to put the recording of this program on our website. And if the panelists want to send me written versions of your remarks, I'd be more than happy to try to assemble them and see what we could do about circulating those as well. So I just want to join everybody who has already spoken by offering my thanks to all of you for taking not just the time to come in, but also really engaging at a deep level with the complexity of these questions. And I hope that perhaps in another year we can reconvene and see how things have changed, because this is obviously not an issue or a set of challenges that are going to go away. And we do need to keep engaging in a dynamic way and re-questioning our assumptions about how we proceed. So thank you all, and thanks to the audience for being with us today.